Hello, this is part two of our series Systemic Racism in America. This is the online version, which is a little bit more concise, but we'll cover most all the same material. So in this session, which was originally presented Wednesday evening, and this is now Friday evening, I aim to demonstrate via the origins of America, the early documents of America, the history of slavery in America, America's laws, court cases, present realities. I aim to demonstrate through all those things that this country does indeed have a history of systemic racism. Now let's start by going all the way back to pre-Columbus days. We have in Europe before and at the time of Columbus, we have a series of decrees that were made by the popes, papal bulls they were called, and they established kind of the mindset of these Europeans that came across the Atlantic to the Americas. The first one of these in 1452 was given by Pope Nicholas, and he gave this basically freedom to the Portuguese leader. He said they had permission to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, that was their word for Muslims back then, and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate the kingdoms, principalities, and to convert them to their use. That's Pope Nicholas giving the Portuguese kind of free rein in the new territories. There were other papal bulls that were made that expanded that dominion so that they could expand as far as they wanted into discovered land. And that word discovered is key. Even though there were already people there, they treated it like a discovery because they saw themselves as superior to the natives that were there. In other words, the way from the church's perspective, what was good for Europe was good for the church, because if the Europeans were able to spread their dominion, then the church would follow right behind or simultaneously and be able to spread the kingdom of God. And so whatever was in their way was just in the way of the gospel from their point of view. And that's where we have somebody like Christopher Columbus coming across the Atlantic in the late 1400s. And obviously he's a point of controversy today. We have people who oppose Columbus Day because of this doctrine of discovery, this idea that he discovered America when in fact not only had there already been, I think, Scandinavian Europeans to America prior to that, but there were tons of people already there. There were natives that were already there. So this is still a controversial, of course, a controversial figure today. But one thing that is worth noting is that on Columbus's very first day in the Americas, he seized 6 natives to be servants for his time there. So just to give you a mindset of what the British leadership government was thinking around this time, what the British in particular, Sir George Peckham said this: the first, these were kind of like the conditions upon which English settlers could establish a settlement. What were the conditions to give them the right to settle in a land that was already occupied by native people? He said the first condition is when Christians, by the good feelings and willing assent of the savages, are allowed by the savages to have quiet possession. So first condition is, that makes sense. If the natives welcome them to establish a settlement, then they're free to establish the settlement. I think we would all agree with that, even if we don't agree with their way of wording this as referring to those natives as savages. But the second one is more interesting in a negative way. It says the second condition is when Christians are unjustly repulsed and they seek to attain and maintain the right for which they come. In other words, if the natives repulse this advancement, if they push back against this advancement, the Europeans, the British in this case, are just allowed to declare that unjust because they have a right, what would later be known as manifest destiny. they have a destiny and a right to settle this land. So basically, that's another way of saying whenever we want to, we have the right to colonize and to establish settlements in the new land. So another quote here from Michelle Alexander, who we'll be referring to quite a bit in this session. She said, eliminating savages is less of a moral problem than eliminating human beings, and therefore American Indians came to be understood as a lesser race, uncivilized savages, thus providing justification for the extermination of the native people. And that's key to what we're talking about. The Europeans had to view the natives as less human in order to justify in their minds the way that they treated those natives. Now, if you think I'm being a little harsh on the early colonists, then let's just take it from Teddy Roosevelt himself. Teddy Roosevelt obviously went on to become the 26th president of the United States from 1901 to 1909, but previous to his presidency, he wrote a 4-volume history of America. And this was a widely read history, and even after it being widely read, he was elected as president. So I think this is fairly representative of the mindset of the American people around the year 1900. And so let's listen to how he thinks through the history of the early colonization of America. He says, whether the whites won the land by treaty, by armed conquest, or, as was actually the case, by a mixture of both, mattered comparatively little, so long as the land was won. It was all important that it should be won for the benefit of civilization and in the interests of mankind. So you can see that sense of superiority that we have to do this. And he goes on to say, all men of sane and wholesome thought must dismiss with impatient contempt the plea that these continents should be reserved for the use of scattered savage tribes, whose life was but a few degrees less meaningless, squalid, and ferocious than that of the wild beasts. You can clearly see there, he's thinking of these native people as akin to animals, and they're just savages, and it's almost insane to think, from his perspective, of not overtaking them. And then he goes on, most fortunately, the hard, energetic, practical men who do the rough pioneer work of civilization in barbarous lands are not prone to false sentimentality. And I guess what he means by false sentimentality there is maybe some reserve about annihilating the native people. And he calls these sentimental people stay-at-homes. These stay-at-homes don't understand the racial importance of the work which is done by their pioneer brethren. It is of incalculable importance that America, Australia, and Siberia should pass out of the hands of their red, black, and yellow aboriginal owners and become the heritage of the dominant world races. That kind of speaks for itself, the way that Roosevelt was thinking about these things, but also I think the way that a lot of Americans were thinking of these things, and it's pretty ugly. So this worldview that was present in the early colonists, that was present throughout the 1600s, or 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. It was developing over all this time more and more. This, of course, found its way into the nation's founding documents, which were written in the late 1700s. So I want to start with the Declaration of Independence and show how this worldview, this European supremacy worldview, white supremacy worldview, found its way into the Declaration of Independence, and then we'll talk about the Constitution. Just to sum up what I'm about to say, Jemar Tisby says, while white soldiers and political leaders were declaring inalienable rights to independence, they were also enslaving countless women, men, and children of African descent. So the very people who were writing the Declaration of Independence and talking about things like freedom were simultaneously keeping some people from freedom by owning slaves. And many of the signers of the Declaration of Independence actually did own slaves, including the main author, Thomas Jefferson himself. He was a slave owner. Yet he's the one who says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, that's a good sounding statement. Those are very famous words, but it's inconsistent with his own lifestyle, that he was a slaveholder. And it's in that worldview of seeing other people as not really men, not really fully human, comes out a little bit later in the document. Now, as you know, the Declaration of Independence included a list of 27 grievances against the British monarchy. Number 7 was that the monarchy was preventing the colonists from claiming land west of the Appalachians. They were upset. The colonists were upset that they weren't being allowed to take more land from the natives. And number 27 was provoking the merciless Indian savages against us. So that that is an important thing too, that they still were in the very document, the Declaration of Independence. They were talking about these natives as merciless Indian savages. So that's the kind of language that they use, and that's worth noting. It's also interesting to see what statements did not make it into the Declaration of Independence. We have evidence of drafts, proposals that were made that were supposed to be part of the Declaration that didn't make the final cut. And one of those said, "The British monarchy is violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere." So this was a statement that could have made it into the Declaration of Independence. It was a statement clearly against the slave trade, but it got put on the sideline. It got rejected for the final document, and that in itself is telling. Well, let's look at the Constitution of the United States. It says, "It starts, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union and to establish justice," and it's just one of the early statements, but I like that statement, to establish justice. One of the purposes of the Constitution was to establish justice. But did they really establish justice for all, or was it just for, or primarily for, white landowning men? The Constitution goes on to say in Article 1, Section 2, the whole number, this is talking about representation, the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. So it's really talking about white landowning men, and it's excluding Indians, and it's only counting other persons as 3/5 of a person, which kind of goes against our modern sensibilities, and rightfully so. But I just want to demonstrate that this was the way that they thought at the time. We also see in Article 4, Section 2, no person held to service in one state escaping into another shall be discharged from such service, but shall be delivered up on claim. There was a debate in the forming of the Constitution over slavery, and the southern states wanted to ensure that slavery would not be illegal in the United States. And so they made sure that this statement was in here. If a slave escapes the South, they're not free in the North. The North has to send them back. They'll be delivered up on claim. So this was built right into the Constitution. Michelle Alexander says, the structure and content of the original Constitution was based largely on the effort to preserve a racial caste system, slavery, while at the same time affording political and economic rights to whites, especially propertied whites. So I think that's a fair assessment of the Constitution. She also says the southern slaveholding colonies would agree to form a union only on the condition that the federal government would not be able to interfere with the right to own slaves. So this was the kind of the foundation of our nation. And Jemar Tisby adds, without question, the Constitution had the rights of wealthy white men in mind, while other groups like indigenous peoples, women, and enslaved blacks held a lesser status. Now, those were the founding documents. How did they play out? How did they actually treat people throughout the 1800s? We'll start with the Native people. The treatment of the Native people had a series of terrible highlights. In 1830, they passed, Andrew Jackson led the charge for the Indian Removal Act, which basically just said Native people that were living east of the Mississippi were to be relocated. Some of them, a small percentage, may have went voluntarily, but most of them went against their will, relocated to the west of the Mississippi. This relocation eventually became known as the Trail of Tears. which was highlighted especially in 1838 when gold was discovered in Georgia, and the tribes that lived there were forced. The Cherokee tribes were forced west of the Mississippi, and many of them died on that voyage, and so it became known as the Trail of Tears. We also have this phrase, manifest destiny, was coined by probably by John O'Sullivan, who was a media guy. He was a news editor, and he coined this idea of manifest destiny, which was basically that white Europeans have a destiny to go from sea to sea in America, to make it all the way across this land. And we talked about last week Richard Henry Pratt and the first boarding schools. So the idea here was let's not kill the natives, but let's assimilate them by taking their children into our boarding schools and making them more European. And he used the phrase kill the Indian in him and save the man. And so this really just flows out of the mindset that was present in the Europeans that came over and present in even the founding documents of the nation. Let's go on to the treatment of blacks in the constitutional days. The slave trade was a huge part of early American history. And now it didn't start like we might imagine it was just automatically this massive institution or system of slavery, but it didn't quite start like that. Most poor Europeans weren't wanting to come across the ocean to work in the colonies. The natives were too well connected to be forced into labor, and so the European businesses were searching for labor, and they came up with a solution to their labor shortage, and that was by taking people from Africa. Now, at first, this may have been through the form of indentured servanthood. So we have evidence of that people would come to pay off debts. African people could come, some white people would come, and they would pay off their debts through short-term work agreement. But what happened is they began to lose their rights in the mid-17th century, these indentured servants. Now, some of this is interesting. Now, you should know at this point that not all of the people that began to lose their rights and become what we would today call slaves, not all of them originally were black. There were some white slaves and there were some black slaves, and to be honest, there were some blacks who owned slaves. And in fact, in 1640, John Punch, who was a black man, escaped this emerging system with two other people. Three of them escaped. He was the only black man, though. The other two were white. And what's interesting is when they got caught and sentenced to punishment, his punishment was life of servitude. So he essentially became a lifelong slave. Whereas the two white men who were caught received 1 extra year of servitude on their end of their original contract, but then they had to serve the colony in some way for 3 years as well. So there was a discrimination between the black escapee and the two white escapees. And so that was an early case. There was also the case in 1654 of a man named Anthony Johnson, who was a black man who owned a slave, and that slave was taken by another person, and he sued and won the right to this slave back. But he didn't just win it back for the duration of the indentured servanthood, he won it back for life. And so these are some interesting cases early on, just to show you that the slave trade kind of developed over time by the loss of rights of these indentured servants, and it became more and more discriminatory over time. Tisby says it this way: it took decades for patterns of unfree labor to harden into a form of slavery that treated human beings as chattel and dictated a person's station in life based on skin color. So this evolved over time, and this makes sense since racism isn't really based on any valid grounds. It has to be something that develops through bad attitudes and decisions, and this development wasn't really a natural thing. Alexander says that by the mid-1770s, the system of bond labor had been thoroughly transformed into a racial caste system predicated on slavery. The degraded status of Africans was justified on the ground that Negroes, like the Indians, were an uncivilized, lesser race. So let's talk about the slave trade and how this developed. Like I said, began as indentured servanthood, began to lose their rights in or the 1600s. But the peak years of the slave trade were 1700 to 1825. And you might have heard different numbers on the number of slaves. So there was about 10 or 12 million Africans that were brought over to the Americas in slavery, but only about 600,000 were brought specifically to what became the United States of America. About half of those 600,000 were before the Declaration of Independence, and another half came after the Declaration of Independence. Now you might be wondering, where did all the other ones go? Well, a good portion went to Brazil. About 40% of the African slaves went to Brazil. So there were 700,000 slaves in 1790. You notice that's higher than the amount that came over. That's because the slaves were having children. So black slaves or African slaves made up 19% of the population of America in 1790. And what really built the momentum of this slave industry, the slave system, was the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. That led to eventually 4 million slaves by 1860, or 14% of the population. You see the population percentage goes down because so many white people making money that the white population was exploding at this time. But there were 4 million slaves in 1860. There was a series of legal losses, like we talked about the slave codes that happened. The slave codes developed through the mid-1600s, all sorts of different laws that took more and more rights away. And then at the founding of the nation, we had the Dirty Compromise. And the Dirty Compromise was basically the southern states dictating that they wouldn't join the Union if the North didn't agree to take slavery, eliminating slavery or abolishing slavery off the table for 20 years. So slavery was off the table. Abolition was off the table from 1778 to 1808. When 1808 rolled around, they did take the slave trade. They did vote against it and ended the African slave trade. It didn't practically end right away, but they did legally end the African slave trade in 1808, and that's what most of the growth from that point on was, just through the slaves having children. You also had the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise was when Missouri and Maine were added to the Union, and there was a possibility that both of them would be free states, and that would change the balance of power in the Senate and the House. And so they made a compromise that Missouri would be a slave state and Maine would be a free state, so that kept the balance of power the same, and that essentially kept slavery going for several more decades. So in 1850, we had the Fugitive Slave Act, which said anyone in the North must cooperate. It just dictated that they must cooperate to send slaves back to the South if there's a runaway slave. And then the famous Dred Scott decision in 1857. The Dred Scott decision basically said that the Constitution was not for black people. Kind of like what we alluded to earlier, this was spelled out in a legal case in 1857. I have a quote here from the Chief Justice at the time, Roger Taney. He said, "Black people are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States." So he's just point blank. The Constitution wasn't for the benefit of black people. Very, very sad quote. All right, so after the slave trade and the expansion of slavery and the legal losses, we of course have the Civil War, and I'm hoping that you have some familiarity with the history of the Civil War, so we're not going to talk about that to any extent. But after the Civil War was this great period of Reconstruction where a lot of black people gained a lot of rights in a relatively quick amount of time. So we had the passing of the 13th Amendment, which meant no more slavery. We have the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which meant full citizenship for black men. We have the 14th Amendment, which was equal protection under the law. We have the 15th Amendment, which gave them voting rights. We have the Ku Klux Klan Act, which tried to stop voter suppression and interference. We had the Freedmen's Bureau, which had existed, I think, before, but was funded better so that there'd be public assistance for these former slaves. And we had the public education system develop, especially in the South, to allow for young black people to be educated. So We're talking about systemic racism in this seminar, but this is actually the opposite. This is systemic change for the benefit of black people who were experiencing such injustice at that time in America, that this was a systemic attack on that injustice. So that's why I say systemic can be good or bad, but it was good during the period of Reconstruction. Just to show you how fast things changed, Michelle Alexander says, in 1867, at the dawn of the Reconstruction era, no black man held political office. Well, that's kind of to be expected in the South. Yet, 3 years later, at least 15% of all Southern elected officials were black. Well, that's an enormous amount of change in just 3 years. So this Reconstruction period was really making a difference in the world. All right. She also says this is particularly extraordinary in light of the fact that 15 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the high watermark of the civil rights movement, fewer than 8% of all Southern officials were black. So you can make the argument that the Reconstruction period in the 1860s was even more, was able to accomplish even more than the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So this was really a good period of time for justice. W.E.B. Du Bois said, the slave went free. This is kind of the sad news. After you say, like, man, why, if that all that good stuff was happening in the 1860s, then what happened that we got back into what the mess that we know existed after that? So he said, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. Well, how did that take place? Michelle Alexander says there was a backlash against the gains of the African Americans in the Reconstruction era, and it was swift and severe. As African Americans obtained political power and began the long march toward greater social and economic equality, whites reacted with panic and outrage. So this is primarily happening in the South, but happening to some degree all over. But there was just this backlash against all these gains that were being made. Now, just to think practically, imagine you're a former slave owner in the South, and now not only do you no longer have your slaves that were so important to your economic gain, but you also may be living in a town where now one of your former slaves is actually elected to be your representative. So this would have been a real hard thing for white supremacists to deal with, and so there was a backlash. There was a pushback. So unfortunately, the very legislative decisions that were so positive, unfortunately, they contained in them a loophole. And if I know anything about evil spirits, evil men and women, just evil systems, they love loopholes. And so in the 13th Amendment, we have this great statement: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. Would that it just said that, but there's some space in between here. And you might know what's in that space. Let me put it on the screen for us. Except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So there's no slavery unless you are being punished for a crime. Now the problem with that is that left a loophole that many people in the South began to take advantage of shortly thereafter. And so after the Civil War, we have the development of what is now known as Jim Crow laws, and we have just a terrible and lengthy period of these Jim Crow laws. So let's talk about that before we move on to some other issues. The kind of behind the emergence of the Jim Crow laws was the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan, and the Ku Klux Klan developed during this Reconstruction period, and they suppressed voting and things like that, and they keep popping up in American history, kind of like a manifestation of the evil of the American systemic racism. So the KKK just kept popping up, but this is kind of where they first emerged on the scene. But they came up with vagrancy laws, for instance. Vagrancy laws was that, hey, if you don't have a job, that's actually a crime. You can't just be doing nothing. in the middle of the day. So obviously, a lot of slaves were unemployed after slavery. They couldn't find jobs, and so they were um, convicted of not having a job. And then because the 13th Amendment had that loophole, they could then be basically re-enslaved because they were lawbreakers, and that was the loophole. There was also at this time a wedge driven between the poor white people and the poor black people, because the powers that be they became aware that, hey, if all these poor people unify, they would have the votes to change things for the long term. And so there was a political move to put a wedge between poor whites and poor blacks, especially in the South. And so one populist speaker said, "You are kept apart that you may be separately fleeced of your earnings. You are made to hate each other, because upon that hatred is rested the keystone of the arch of financial despotism that enslaves you both." He was trying to appeal to both white and black poor people to bring about change. So we have these vagrancy laws, this wedge between the poor. We have segregation laws, the Jim Crow laws, which lasted from 1877 to 1965. That's a long stretch of America's history where these Jim Crow laws were in place. And they included things like poll taxes. So you can't vote unless you pay a poll tax, but most of the black people, the former slaves, didn't have enough money to pay those taxes. There was grandfather clause. You can't vote unless your grandfather or your father voted. Well, obviously, most black people couldn't meet those requirements, or a literacy test to vote. You can't vote unless there's a literacy test. So this is just all the things that the white supremacists came up with to keep the black people down after that period of great freedom that they were beginning to have during Reconstruction. So there was other things like no interracial marriage was allowed. So we have this kind of like segregation happening more and more. No interracial marriage. Any infraction of law could lead to lynching. And then you have this great famous case, Plessy versus Ferguson, which said that this doctrine that the Southern white supremacists came up with, separate but equal. They basically said, hey, the whites stay over here and the blacks stay over here, and as long as they're equal, then this is a good way to do society. And Plessy versus Ferguson, the result of that case was that, yeah, that's good. That's a good policy. Separate but equal is a good way to run the South. And so this was the Jim Crow period. By the turn of the 20th century, every state in the South had laws on the books that disenfranchised blacks and discriminated against them in virtually every sphere of life: schools, churches, housing, jobs, restrooms, hotels, restaurants, hospitals, orphanages, prisons, so on and so forth. This was all kind of taken back away. Yet in the 1950s, with extraordinary bravery, civil rights leaders, activists, and progressive clergy launched boycotts, marches, and sit-ins protesting the Jim Crow system. They endured fire hoses, police dogs, bombings, and beatings by white mobs, as well as by the police. And so after many, many years, there finally became a bold movement to try to bring an end to this Jim Crow system. And obviously, Martin Luther King Jr. is a big part of that, and I'm hoping you know a lot about him, so we won't cover that material. And so, as the civil rights movement emerged, there were some legal victories. The first big one, was probably the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision. And this was a 9-0 decision that the separate but equal idea was just inherently not equal. As everyone knew practically that the black schools and whatnot were nowhere near equal in funding and resources to the white schools. And so this was a huge decision. Applying it was a little harder than just deciding the case, but it took years for some of the changes to be made. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was obviously huge. This outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex. So it's a huge change, systemic change for the good. Then you have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which meant no discrimination for voting. And so What happened after that? Well, whites began once again to search for a new racial order. Barred by law from invoking race explicitly, those committed to racial hierarchy were forced to search for new means of achieving their goals. So, I think I mentioned this last time, but it's very true. It's kind of like this game of whack-a-mole. Like you're knocking down these evil manifestations, these manifestations of racism, but as soon as you hit one down, one of these systems, another system pops up, and it's just hard to actually kill the beast. And so we have this emergence of a new Jim Crow. And maybe not as many people are familiar with this phrase, the new Jim Crow, but it's the form of systemic race. It's the form that racism took after the civil rights victories. So basically, after the civil rights victories, there was an emphasis on law and order, and the mindset of white supremacists kind of changed to we've got to stop crime. We've got to have this eventually a war on drugs, and this led to a prison explosion. And so there's a lot I could say about this. I don't have a ton of time to say everything that I could say, but I would highly recommend Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. But essentially, the funding to fight drugs escalated enormously during this new Jim Crow period. And you might say, well, isn't that a good thing to go against drugs? The problem was that the way it was administered was systemically racist. So I'm not an expert on cocaine. You might be glad to know. But in any case, there's different kinds of cocaine, and black people tended to use crack cocaine, and white people tended to use the powder type of cocaine. And so in the war on drugs, as you might guess, the target was demographics. The target demographically was people who were using crack cocaine. They specifically targeted black neighborhoods. And there's reasons why black neighborhoods were black neighborhoods. That was part of systemic racism too. But they specifically targeted those. Another way to say it is during this time, public money going towards housing development went down 61%, but tax money going towards prison development went up 171%. So you're basically spending less money to help poor people find housing, and instead you're kind of giving them you're spending tons of money to give them new housing that's in jail. And this is exactly what was going on. Michelle Alexander says, what is most concerning about the new racial caste system, however, is that it may prove to be more durable than its predecessors, because this new system is not explicitly based on race. It is easier to defend on seemingly neutral grounds. It doesn't have the racist language in it. It's just in the practice that it ends up being systemically racist. Here's how it kind of works, as Michelle Alexander says. Step one is the roundup. Black people are targeted demographically because of the neighborhoods they live in, the kinds of crimes that they're more prone to because of their situation. White people, for instance, I should say this: drug use amongst whites and blacks is about even. There's not any real statistical variance there, but they target black neighborhoods and black drug use and the kinds of drugs that black people tend to be using. So there's the roundup, and then they have control. Once they've arrested you and gotten something on your record, then you're in the system. And the invisible punishment is that black people can't get out of the system, because even if you get out of jail, by that time you're extremely poor, and you're prevented a lot of times from certain housing opportunities, loan opportunities, employment opportunities. There's all sorts of opportunities that you're not going to get because you have stuff on your record. And the reason you have stuff on your record is because you were racially targeted in many of these cases. So some comparison and contrast between the Jim Crow of earlier years and the new Jim Crow is that in both Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow, we have legalized discrimination, political disenfranchisement, and racial segregation. But the new Jim Crow is different in that it harms more white people. So there are white people that kind of get harmed by this new Jim Crow system because there's no way to to definitely just make no white people suffer from it, because some white people live in black neighborhoods and whatnot. And there's more support from the black community because some of the people in the black community aren't in those situations necessarily. And there are things to be said for ways that the black community can change some of their approaches to their own systems. And so there are things to be said. There's usually some truth in different positions, and there's plenty of black people that want to say we got to get our own house in order. But my point here is that the system was working against the majority of black people. Michelle Alexander says, it is fair to say that we have witnessed an evolution in the United States from a racial caste system based entirely on exploitation, that was slavery, to one based largely on subordination, that was Jim Crow, to one defined by marginalization, mass incarceration. So her main point in her book is that many black people, especially black men, have been incarcerated, and it's still kind of using this loophole that was found in the 13th Amendment. They've been incarcerated by being targeted for certain crimes and then put in jail, having this record. The amount, I think I read that, America has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's incarceration. And so we're incarcerating an enormous amount of people and a disproportionate amount of black people. And so a lot of times you'll hear a white person say, where are the black men to step up and get their own house in order? And the answer is they're in jail, or their families are broken because of their time in jail. And the reason they're in jail is not just because they're criminals. It's not because they were worse necessarily than other people. It's that a young black man gets arrested and put in jail and gets a record for something that, by and large, a lot of young white men don't get in trouble for. And so there's in the experience of the people in the country, there's a systemic racism, even if the law is not explicitly racist. This system of control depends far more on racial indifference than racial hostility. I think that's a good way to end this seminar. This is basically saying that previously, like with slavery and with Jim Crow, there was a necessity of some hostility toward black people. But this current system, the new Jim Crow, you really just have to be indifferent. You just have to be unaware that this is happening to allow it to continue to happen. Until we become more aware of this racial profiling, targeting, this mass incarceration problem in America, until we become more aware of it and less indifferent about it, I don't think much will change. But thankfully, there's been some signs that we're becoming more aware of systemic racism in America, so that we can finally hit that mole in such a way that it doesn't pop back up. That's got to be our prayer. And like I said at the end of last week's session, the church, I think, needs to lead the way in speaking the truth about this boldly. So in summary, we've seen that racism developed into a system in America. Racist systems have been attacked. There's been numerous systems, whether it be slavery, Jim Crow, or the new Jim Crow. But racism has outlived multiple attacks. It just keeps popping back up, and it's always looking for a new system. We might during this present moment in our culture, we might be able to knock down the new Jim Crow practices. But if we don't deal with the heart level issue, if we don't deal with the remaining legal issues, if we don't deal with the systemic issues, it'll just find a way to pop back up again. If we don't develop just a vast majority of people that are just done with racism in all its forms, we're not going to have a complete victory for this, what I would consider to be America's sin. Well, next week I want to talk about the role of the church. I will argue that large and key sections of the church have been complicit in supporting systemic racism, but I will also argue that the only way racism will ultimately be defeated is through the spiritual warfare of the church. Well, I think that is a good place to stop. I hope that you learned some things from there, or that if you'd like to comment and explain some things to me that could be added to this presentation, that would be great. So we'll have this session available, and then you can either come next week to session 3, the final session, or you can wait till the recording, which will be put online later next week. Hope you've enjoyed the presentation. We do have some homework that's available online. We'll have a movie night on Tuesday. We'll announce that movie on Sunday, and then we'll be meeting together to finish the series up on Wednesday at 6:30.